A major new study says cannabis remains by far the most commonly used drug around the world, but amphetamine use is rising.
The study also shows more people in Australia and New Zealand use marijuana and amphetamines than anywhere else in the world. Our reporter Ryan Shields joins us now from Fitzroy for more of the story. He's in Melbourne. Ryan, good morning.
Good morning. Well, you're right. There has been a series of articles posted in the medical journal, The Lancet, dealing with drug addiction and law enforcement policies around the area of drugs. The one that's been capturing most of the attention have been those figures on the rates of use here in Australia and New Zealand. Our rates of use for marijuana are 3 times the global average, and for speed amphetamines, it's double the global average. So quite astounding figures. I'm joined by Professor Robin Rowe, who works at the Turning Point Drug and Alcohol Centre, for a bit of further analysis. Do those figures surprise you as an expert in the field?
No, they don't. Basically, we're right in the middle of the pack for rich countries, essentially. Rich countries use more drugs than poor countries do, by and large.
And could the high figures for Australia and New Zealand therefore be a reflection of our economic resilience over recent years compared to others in Europe and North America, say?
Yeah, but it's also true that if you unpacked Europe, you'd see countries in Europe that had a higher rate of use than Australia does. The high figures are mostly about cannabis, mostly about marijuana. If you look on a global basis, in fact, 3/4 of the people who are using illicit drugs are using only cannabis. So if you take that away, then the figures look rather smaller.
Your research deals more in particular with the law enforcement, or the legal framework around drugs and the treaties that Australia, among other countries, has signed over the years. Yeah. You say they're constraining our ability to effectively deal with the drug problem. How so?
Well, there's a system that was essentially set in place 50 years ago in the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which essentially requires countries not only to limit what they do in terms of international trade in drugs, but also requires them to do things in their domestic market. You're not allowed to have a legal market in drugs. You have to, under the 1988 treaty, you have to criminalize, have a criminal penalty for use of the drug or possession of the drug. Now, some Australian states have experimented with that in terms of cannabis, but they've been limited in what they can do by trying to stay within the treaties, essentially, and so they end up with a situation where they have a kind of halfway measure of a infraction notice, essentially, what we did in our paper was that we looked at the examples that we could find where there had been changes which had decriminalized use and possession, and basically it doesn't make any difference in the consumption rates. Whether people use more or less is not dependent on whether or not personal use and possession is criminalized. So this is something that it doesn't make sense to continue with. It's a waste of police time, and it's a minor annoyance at one end and a substantial disability to people who are caught using drugs and their families.
Now, Australia, correct me if I'm wrong, has the ability to opt out of these treaties. Why don't we? Is there no political will?
Until this year, until 2011, no country had ever opted out of any of these treaties. There's a very strong international consensus, and the U.S. is very keen on countries belonging to these treaties. Now Bolivia has denounced one of them and is announcing it's going to re-accede again with a reservation with respect to coca leaf chewing, because it says coca leaf chewing is a custom in their country that isn't particularly harmful, and that it shouldn't be included within the conventions. They weren't able to persuade other countries of that, and so fundamentally they had to drop out of the treaty, come back in with a reservation. And that's the way in which a particular country, Australia for instance, could make changes if it wanted to.
And if we did want to, if we did go down that track, what are the changes domestically that would allow us to do once we're freed of the provisions of these international treaties?
Well, if you're going the route of re-acceding to them, then there's still going to be a lot of the international treaties that apply, and I would think that it would make sense to keep all of the provisions that have to do with international trade, that you don't wish problems on other countries. It seems to me there are two issues that Australia may want to needs to have a policy discussion about. Does it make sense to have use and possession of drugs criminalised? And secondly, are there any of these substances that have been banned in the 20th century that we need to look at again in terms of whether there should be some kind of regulated domestic market?
It seems that we used to have prohibition for alcohol and other drugs, and we've obviously moved away from that. It seems you'd be advocating a similar route with these, what we call now, illicit drugs.
Well, essentially the international drug structure, if you look at it, the international drug prohibition structure came out of the alcohol prohibition era, essentially. It was the one piece that was left behind when they decided that maybe alcohol prohibition wasn't such a good idea. If you look across the legal drugs and the illicit drugs, that is tobacco and alcohol compared with other drugs, then it doesn't make sense in terms of where the harm sits. There's substantially more harm in the world from tobacco and alcohol than there is from all the illicit drugs put together. We really need to rethink our drug and alcohol policy in terms of thinking of them in the same frame.
And just finally, do you think we'll still be having this same debate in years to come, or will we hopefully move on in the short term?
I don't think there's going to be a huge shift in the short term, but I think that there are some steps that Australian governments could take.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Robin Room. It's obviously a debate which has been going on for many, many decades and looks like it's set to continue.
Ryan Shields at Fitzroy, thank you very much for that.